happen to be in a Jeep right now in Arizona, rock crawling, and I am with one of all of our favorite lenders, Aaron Chapman. And one thing that I think is really cool about Aaron is he is not your typical lender who just quotes your rates, gets you your loans, closes your loans, although we really like that quality also. Aaron dives into why we do this. Like, for instance, one of my favorite things I'm going to have him talk about while he drives this Jeep is, a lot of people ask, should I get a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage? And Aaron has a take on this that I totally buy into, that I've never heard anywhere else, and I think could be super beneficial for all of you to hear. So, let's switch camera over here.
What's up, guys?
All right, Aaron. So people always want to know, should they get a 15 or a 30 year? What is your take on it?
So I have it started off because that question started coming up a lot at one point, and I had to come up with a reason as to why it made more sense to go with the 30 year. But a lot of times the main reason folks would want to do the 15 versus the 30 because they're carrying debt. And then, you heard folks like Robert Kiyosaki talk about good debt versus bad debt. I had to really understand, is this really debt? So what I started wrapping my mind around is in my opinion, it's not debt. It's the greatest asset in the deal. It's not the real estate. It's not the cash flow. It's not the cap rate. It's not the cash on cash return. It's truly the ability to leverage in something that is paid by somebody else. And then you get to thinking about the rate of inflation. I got to remembering back 30 years ago, 1990, I was riding a skateboard, that kind of thing. My mom would give me a buck to go down to the corner store, and I could buy a gallon of milk. I could buy something for me and still bring home change. Not possible today, right? So we do know inflation has done something to erode the value or the purchasing power of the dollar. So I remember talking about this, and I got to thinking, and I've heard people talk about it. Many people say inflation-induced debt destruction. There's all these different terms that have been used to reference how inflation, or at least how a long-term leverage is a hedge against inflation, but never has there been an actual number put to it. So what I had started to speculate on as I'm trying to calculate this out is exactly at what point are you stop paying the debt when you are still making payments? And as I'm discussing this on a podcast and in a way kind of guessing at the number, or at least how long it's going to take before you're not paying the debt anymore, I got a call from the professor of accounting at Kennesaw State University, who was a client at the time. He's like, dude, you got to come speak to my students. And from there, we started working on this tool. And he created this tool for me that I could run the numbers. So I'm going to have you guys do some math right now. So if you're watching, stop, pause, go get a pen, get paper, and let's write this down. We all back? Here's what you're going to do. We're going to start with the baseline. $100,000 purchase. This is a single family. We're going to say 20% down, right? 30-year fixed with a $200 a month cash flow and a 1% rent to value ratio. Is anybody, let me just ask Allie, do you think any of that's completely unfounded? Does that seem like a reasonable transaction?
Good.
Seems reasonable. Okay. So in that reasonable transaction, what we're going to say here is that you've got, let's get into a lot more than just inflation. Let's get into, where's the real value here? So if you've got a $100,000 acquisition, you put 20% down. I'm going to ask Allie, how much is that? How much is 20% of 100,000?
20 grand.
20 grand. So that means you're financing what dollar amount?
80 grand.
80,000.
Oh man, I'm on the spot. I feel like my math, I hope it's on par here.
Yep, you financed 80,000. And then we missed our spot. So we're going to have to go back.
Missed our turn?
Yeah, we're going to take a little rock crawling trail back. We've been on the trail instead of on the rock crawling trail. So you got 80 grand. Okay. So if you did your job as the CEO of your real estate investment business, this is what you are. You're not just an investor, you're the CEO of a company. That company owns little businesses called houses that people rent. Now, if you did your job of working with the right people that manage the property and it stays reasonably rented for the entire time you own it, who's paying back that 80,000?
Your tenants.
The tenant, exactly. The tenant's paying the 80,000. So you might want to show them the rock crawl.
Yeah, let's see. Well, we're talking about things like inflation.
I'll keep talking. So You got
These are our motivators.
The tenant is paying off the $80,000. Okay. So since the tenant's paying the 80 grand, let's take that 80 grand over 30 years. We're going to do a 30-year mortgage. And in 30 years, they're going to pay that off, and you're going to take 80,000, you're going to divide it by 30, so you know how much money they're paying off over those 30 years. So over that 30 years, that becomes $2,666.66 per year. Do the math. 80,000 divided by 30. So then you take that $2,666.66, you divide that into your 20,000, because that was your investment in the deal. And what you end up finding is that your 20,000 is growing by 13.33% of the original 20,000 every single year. Now think about that. You put in 20 grand, that's your investment. Your tenant's paying the rent, but paying off the lender, which is like a business partner. Your business partner is taking $405 a month basically for 30 years. And as they're getting paid off, I know there's an amortization table. People say, wait, it's heavy interest for the first 5 years. We'll get into that later too. But when you think about this, averaged over the 30 years, your 20% is growing by 13.33% every single year for 20 years. That's a big deal, right? Now, we're going to set that aside. That's a big growth in itself. Now, we get to raise rents because of inflation. If you look at the national average, last I looked, it's about 3.6%. You can't factor in New York. You can't factor in San Francisco. Right now, they're plummeting. Right? In fact, New York, I had heard that seen as much as a 17% decline in rents because of what's going on in the market. But so let's just say you've got this decline. Now you got the ability to increase rents by 3% per year. Let's just say 3%. Well, you're getting 1% rent to value ratio, right? What's 1% of 100,000? It's $1,000 a month, right? So what's 3% of 1,000? You raise the rents by 3%. It's only $30. Some of you probably thought 300. So 300 is not. It's disappointing when you start figuring out it's only $30. Well, since it's only $30, now you're like, damn, man, it's not very good. Well, if you're making $200 a month in cash flow year one, now you're making reasonably $230 year two, because you bought correct, right? You bought in a place you're not getting these massive jumps in costs, and not massive jumps in maintenance because you didn't buy a piece of junk. Well, now you're seeing that 30% growth, that $30 growth in your cash flow 200 is a 15% growth in your cash flow. And that's compound growth. That's where it starts to get really sexy, the fact that you've got a compound growth to work with. So now, because you're getting a compound growth because of inflation, does the lender get to raise rents because of inflation? Or raise payments, sorry. Do you get to raise the payment because of inflation, Allie?
Nope.
No, they got to accept the exact same $405 a month for the entire time, all 30 years. But what's the rate of inflation right now? Do you know, Allie?
I don't.
Many people will say it's under 3%, under 2%, because they're listening to the Fed, the Federal Reserve, talk about the CPI or the PCE. Both of those are measurements of inflation by the Federal Reserve. CPI is Consumer Price Index. PCE is Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. Now, when you think about those, that would make you think that they're kind of following what people are spending their money on, what we need to consume to live. Well, these can't be any bigger mislabeled things in my life. I've never heard anything more mislabeled than these. Because when you start understanding what they factor in there, they don't factor in the real things that people need. What do people need to live? Food, water, shelter, and they need air. But California is the only one that figured out how to tax air, so that's not a federal thing. So yeah, food, water, shelter. They don't put that in there. Guys, they don't factor in what you eat. They don't factor in what you drink. They don't factor in energy costs, so the cost of electricity, none of that. Cost of water, none of that. How about taxes? Are taxes going down? No. How about you that have kids? Does your expenses go down because you have kids? No. It continues to compound. That's not being factored in. So when you really look at the rate of inflation, I encourage you to go to shadowstats.com, as in shadow statistics. You scroll across the top of the screen, you'll see alternate data. Click on that, or just hover over it. You'll do a drop down, and then you click on inflation. Scroll down to the bottom chart. You'll see this divergence between the rate of inflation from the CPI and the rate of inflation of the real expenses of life. You start seeing that real expenses of life is about 10% inflation. Well, 10% inflation is insane, right? Well, I'm not figuring it out to be about 7% inflation when you really start factoring in all the country. So it's 7% inflation because we investors spend our money differently. Well, 7% inflation, you start seeing what happens with the U.S. dollar. Our buying power declines by 7% every year. What does that look like? There's three more. So when you start looking at one way to illustrate this, go back to 1990. There's a calculator on Shadow Stats. That Shadow Stats calculator starts to show that if you spent $100 in 1990, you'd need to spend $1,100 today to get the same amount of goods. That shows you exactly what's happened to the U.S. dollar. So what we did, this Professor Abernathy did for me, he ran a tool that when you recalculate every dollar you're making that payment for 30 years, $405 a month every year for 30 years, when you do the principal and interest numbers, it's a principal of $80,000 plus $62,000 in interest. Or no, sorry, $65,000. So it's $145,000 principal and interest. But when you factor in the inflation numbers and what the value of the dollar is every time you make the payment, it's not $80,000, it's not $65,000 interest, it's not the $145,000 principal and interest, it's $61,000 in change. So as you use the money to grow other things and you slowly give it back, you give it back when it's worth less and less and less, and they got to accept it. So what I tell everybody is, leverage high, leverage long, pay it off slow, use somebody else's money to compound your money. Never pay it off early. Never put more money down than you need to for an interest rate. Somebody says you put 25% down to get a better rate. They're only selling you rate. They just want to close you. It doesn't matter, especially putting 25% down if you're buying multiple properties. Sure, your rate might drop a quarter or 3/8, so you think you're doing something awesome. But when you get to property number 4, that extra 5% is equal to the same down payment you have done on property number 5. And never in the history of my career since 1997 have I seen 4 properties leveraged less with a slightly lower interest rate outperform 5 properties leveraged higher. Never has happened. So you got to rethink how you're doing this. You're not a consumer spending money and going into debt. You're a business owner. You're a CEO. It's time to